Hello and welcome to What the Lux with me, Fred Moore.
And me, Anand Sharma.
Together we lead Matter of Form, a design consultancy specialising in brand, digital experience and content. And this is a podcast that calls time on tired ideas of luxury.
Alongside industry luminaries and thought leaders, we explore what truly defines category-leading products and services.
Today on What the Lux, we're joined by Deborah Calmeyer, founder and CEO of Raw Africa. Deborah's journey from the Zimbabwean bush to building one of the most respected luxury safari companies is driven by a mission to protect Africa's people, wildlife and cultures. Through Raw Africa, she creates experiences that not only connect travellers to the world, but ensure that every journey gives back. Deborah, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you, Fred. It's so great to be here.
I'm really excited by this one. At Matter of Form and personally, we just love Africa and travel in Africa. And you're in an unrivaled position to tell us about traveling in that continent and the experiences on offer, but also a really fascinating journey. I just wanted to start with this quote that I read, I presume from you, which goes, "When you come from Africa, you never stop wanting to share it. Africa can be a harsh place, but it's also a place of warmth, ingenuity, passion, and incredible beauty." Tell us about your relationship with Africa and where it all began.
I think when you leave Africa is when you realize just how much Africa is the answer to, I think, the deep yearning within all of us. You grow up there and you're constantly looking out. It's like you're, in Zimbabwe or South Africa, you're at the very bottom of the continent, right? So you're sort of looking at America and looking at Europe, and you're always wanting to catch up with what's in fashion and what the movies are. And it always looks just like this bigger, brighter world. And I always dreamt of leaving Africa and sort of always felt like we were kind of left behind, forgotten people kind of thing. I mean, I grew up with black and white television, and sort of those crazy things. I also grew up with a lion in the house. So, that's the other side of the coin, right? But when I got to New York, I was 24 and that was the epitome of the concrete jungle, of everything that I felt I'd not had as a child and been left out of. But that was when my absolute craving and homesickness just amplified, and those dreams of the sunsets and sunrises, of the warmth, of the different rhythm, of the pace, of the wildlife, just the ache for that was so incredibly intense. And I think as I've grown over the years and matured, I've realized that everything I was really searching for was back in Africa. And I would make a life of trying to share that with anyone who would let me.
Yeah, and can you just explain for the listeners where you grew up and what Zimbabwe was like back in those times?
Yeah, I mean, look, I remember very clearly as a 5-year-old, we were in the middle of the Bush War in Zimbabwe. It was at the time Rhodesia and under British rule. And so that was a pretty traumatic way to grow up. We were on a farm, we had sandbags all around our house, bulletproof all over the windows, taped sort of to bulletproof them. I mean, it was really pretty scary. Ambushes at night. My dad was always in soldiers' uniforms, and there was a huge amount of fear. And that's sort of my earliest memories. And then once the war was over, my dad was like, out with the security, get rid of everything, don't want alarms, don't want gates. Oh, well, let's just get a lioness and she can live with the Labradors, as you do in the wilds of Africa. And so little Carmel was a rescue, and she arrived and grew up with our 2 Labradors and was in the house and was our greatest protector, but also where I perhaps fell in love with wildlife and really realized how similar we are as humans to animals, and our need for affection and play and hunting and everything I witnessed with her all day long really drew me into a much deeper understanding and appreciation of the similarities between us. And perhaps that's where the love for the wild really was ingrained.
I think that's true of Africa, obviously, if you've grown up amongst it, but most people who've even been there, it kind of never leaves you and you itch to go back again and again, or yearn for something you've experienced there. So you're in New York, and I guess in your 20s, you're working in tech sales. What drove you to start Raw Africa?
So a lot of people would obviously be fascinated by the accent. I didn't sound like it came from Brooklyn, and that
Yes.
would open conversations.
Do Americans understand a kind of Zimbabwean or South African accent?
They don't identify it as Zimbabwean ever. I mean, I would literally fall out of my shoes if someone did. They sometimes say South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, England, I get as well, believe it or not. So, but I've never ever had anyone say, "Are you from Zimbabwe?" I'd be like, "What?" So, yeah, I was having a really fun time living in New York, struggling, knew nobody. And then people would obviously say, I would love to go to Africa. I'd love to go to South Africa. Um, there were small references to Mandela, to safari. And then I started looking at people's itineraries, and people would ask me, "Could you help me? Could you help me?" And it just seemed like very mediocre recommendations. I saw very appalling geography comprehension that I witnessed. And my dad was a retired zoologist and desperate for something to do, very, very high energy. And I said to him, why don't you guide? You grew up during apartheid in South Africa. Why don't you guide people in Cape Town and then take them to the bush? And I'll try to send you maybe a couple of people a year. And that can be a little bit of income and something for you to do. And that was how I started Raw Africa. It was a sort of side gig hobby to rescue my dad from his boredom. And here we are. I did 4 trips the first year. We do about 200 trips a year now. And, one realizes that there's this sort of a lot of innate instinct and knowledge that one can draw on just from a lifetime of growing up in a place. And I'm not selling a destination, I'm sharing my home. And I think there's just such significant intel um, within that, you just can't teach.
20 years or so ago, what was missing? Because, the major luxury tour operators were offering, expansive itineraries in Africa and safaris. What was missing that, I get it, you've got this inside track, you've experienced your bit of Africa and other bits probably in a different way. What was missing that you kind of discovered through doing those first tours?
I don't know whether anything was missing, but certainly being an African in New York City and being present, being able to meet the people, for them to be able to deal with an African stateside and then travel with that very same company and not be hand over to another on the ground handler, as all these countries have to, I mean, all these companies, beg my pardon, have to operate. Like, they're not living between two countries. So you phone somebody in America and they have to hand it over to another operator on the ground in the country they're sending you to. Now, hopefully, they've got a very solid relationship and it all goes fine. But, the more cogs you put in the wheel, the more possible problems. Um, and I think what we were really able to determine is I had the lens on American lifestyle, how hard they work, how hard charging every day was, how little vacation they took, and how magical this rest and sort of recuperation in Africa could really be, and how to design it specifically for them. And then sort of bridge that gap between explaining to my team on the ground, this is the environment this human is coming from. This is how rattled they're really going to be when they get into your hands. And this is how we're going to wrap them in love and share our home with them in a very gentle way so that they can surrender and feel, and sort of an art to what we started to do. But I don't think I would have ever been able to do that had I not been living in the thick of it and watching, I hate to say the word suffering, but watching the suffering of this just intensity of how hard one has to work in this country.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the process of discovering I guess your unique offer must have been so interesting, because I suppose from people outside of the industry probably don't think about how many cogs there are on this chain. Like you say, there's a DMC in each country. There's a lot of bits to the process of getting someone on holiday and having a great curated time. You must have discovered that in part by accident the first few years. How did it sort of, your offer evolve to what it is now? Was it happenstance and accident, or did you have a very clear idea from after those first few trips with your dad?
No, it was definitely self-discovery, bit by bit. I think I really understood. It's been like a study of the American psyche, and I'm still studying it. And, you're foreign. You didn't go to school here. You don't have friends here. You don't have family here. You might be speaking a relatively similar English, but you are really studying human beings in a totally different setting, how they live, how they relax, what upsets them. You just have to go through an American airport to understand how awful the experience is and how desperately that needs to change. And it's so unnecessarily awful. Um, and so, bit by bit, things I've endured that I don't want for anybody, that I've changed and tweaked. And I think it's a constant learning, and one is constantly upping the game of, this isn't the way it should be. It doesn't have to be like this. How can you call it luxury if it's not luxury? And I hate the way that term has just been generalized and commodified. And we need a new word.
Well, it's a good point, that, and I want to get on to how you've evolved into some of the things you're doing now, which are insanely innovative and all of that. But luxury and your definition of it, I've got another quote here you said, which I love, which I think it's from you again. It says, "When time is the ultimate luxury, the wealth of the experience is the freedom within it." Well, that's not a bad definition of luxury.
Yeah, that's absolutely luxury for me, right? The freedom within it. The freedom to move, the freedom not to worry, the freedom to be, for the shoulders to drop, for the breath to come, to be fully present in the moment. Do you think many people even understand why they travel? And that's a really interesting question. Like, why do we travel? And then what is luxury to you? And that is constantly feeding my intelligence and my design of, what are people looking for? They're looking to escape. They're looking for something that elevates them beyond the daily grind, right? That sets them free. And how can you be free in experience if you're worrying about where your passport got lost, or your luggage, or your next flight, or all the things that come at you and fight you, right? And so much of our work is an art in designing how to bring that down, how to drop that, how to remove those obstacles. We already thought of, you missed your espresso that you have every morning because you took a flight at 5 a.m. and there wasn't any in the airport. So let's have it for you on the runway as you land, in a little hot espresso cup, because otherwise you're going to get a headache. You know, tiny, tiny little detail like that that's feeding our design all the time.
Yeah, and I find it so interesting, the fact that you talk about, which I haven't thought about enough, the micro or macro differences between the American tourist versus, say, it's very different how someone from China or Germany is worried about things in the pre-booking stage, wants to experience things on the ground, etc. And it is very much distilling that you've created something unique, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, I think it is fascinating because our sort of European culture and African culture is more similar. I think because of how hard Americans work, because of how much they have to value that vacation time, one truly has to understand the hot buttons and the cold buttons, and how to bring them into this sort of gentle state of surrender, also so that they can feel safe and open to the experience rather than terrified, because Africa's scary. It's overwhelming. People are nervous, and that nervousness feeds on itself if you don't bring it down, right?
And the problem is, it can lead to over sanitized experiences because you still want to expose them to the real Africa, as you described, as we talked about in the intro. I'm also, for you personally, when someone's been on a trip, what's the most thrilling bit of feedback you can get? What gives you that kind of dopamine hit when someone comes back and gives you some nice feedback?
So interestingly, feedback I never ever expected and seems way too sort of complimentary is, Deborah, you changed my life. I see the world differently now. And I've heard that so many times over, which has led me to work with psychiatrists, psychologists, energy workers, trying to understand what is happening to somebody on this experience, that I'm getting this kind of feedback, that Italy, Paris, wherever it may be, doesn't get. So tell me, help me. And through that work and discovery, I've really understood, we're taking people back to everything we came from, everything we've evolved from. Our natural instincts are being re-engaged. Think about our day to day. We run from rain. We never chew our food. We don't smell our food. We just churning through life and trying to cope. And we're missing all these deeply pleasurable moments of our five sensory organs, really, right? And so I think that, the landscape itself is that magical painting that one perhaps goes to a museum for and goes, oh, wow. So you're in that setting, and then how to be in that setting in peace and then be surrounded by loving people. And it's just like peeling off the layers and all the human scaffolding comes down, and we suddenly actually in touch with ourself again. And that in itself is a remarkable achievement to have been able to offer somebody that space, right? That setting. And then it goes on to the squeeze of the hand of the partner, or the look of the eye of the children, or the tears that roll of joy. And it's that emotion that comes with these experiences that I feel so privileged to be able to have the chance to design for people. And, they think they're coming once, but when you've created that emotional container, they come every year, because where else is going to feed the soul like this?
It's an amazing answer to that, but I also know there's another side to the experience which will give you joy, which is, of course, I think you see, as we would see, luxury tourism in Africa as a way of improving things, be that communities, be that conservation. There's another quote here of, you've written, I think, if African women rise, wildlife will thrive. Can you just explain about that side of raw Africa?
Sure. And that's our vision statement, and everything I've tried to deploy in the sort of design of the company as well as the experience. So it's 85% female, the whole company. And I think that, where I saw the opportunity with tourism in Africa is that it's so innate to females to be caregivers, as mothers, as teachers, whatever. We're always in a caregiving role. And so tourism feels like a really natural fit for women. But traditionally, unfortunately, women have been kept in housekeeping and reservations, and it's seldom that they've been able to rise into leadership positions. So, having lived in New York and got a voice and a lot of confidence and power, I really wanted to take that back to Africa and share that with other women, from the incredible American women that have helped me along my way and helped me find my voice. And so, we do an annual retreat called a Women's Empowerment Retreat, and we do it in a different country every year. And that is really to highlight women in the industry who fly planes, who carry rifles, who drive Land Rovers, who, fly helicopters, who are sommeliers, who are running lodges, who are executive chefs, and who haven't had the chance to highlight their story or talk about their progression and how they got there. And these stories are just remarkable. So it's a little bit of a TED Talks on safari for the guests. They're getting to hear about people and stories and challenges and lives that, have been created in the most terribly difficult situations, and it's quite inspiring for us to learn those things. It's also very rewarding for the speakers to have the opportunity to engage with these audiences. And wonderfully, a lot of funding comes from the guests into these projects, and whether it's, elephant human conflict, whether it's rhino tagging, whether it's menstrual health, there's all these different sort of echelons that get spoken about and shared on these trips, and then developed into films, books, TED Talks, all sorts of things that have come out of it. But I think more than anything is the sense of community, of belonging, of traveling with purpose, of coming and doing great stuff in Africa where one wouldn't have otherwise have been able to reach it, right? Because how would you know about the first female captain in the aviation industry in Botswana. How will you ever find that person? But now you've met her, and now you're seeing what her goals are. And she's started a foundation called Dare to Dream to help other women get into aviation. And that needs funding and education. And now we've got people behind that. And there's so many examples of this. I could go on and on, but it's extraordinary the traction that's happened. And thankfully, the lodges have also really jumped on it and become part of it and are now promoting women. And when they do it, being very visual about it as well.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. But zooming out even one step above that, just about, it's also an obvious point really, but luxury travel in Africa. There are people who would say there are unattractive elements of it. I suppose noblesse oblige, and a lot of rich people coming and not flaunting their wealth, but creating some uncomfortable situations. But can you give the other side of that argument about what luxury travel can and should do in Africa for communities and conservation?
Yeah, I think, people have to understand the COVID example is a very real one. When there was no tourism and there were no game drives going out, there was no protection of the wildlife, and the poachers climbed in and wiped out animals, right? Because there was no protection. So just that little sample, I think, gives people of the idea of just how valuable their tourism is in terms of a protection service for the land and the wildlife. And I like to use really simple examples like that because people are part of that and they can relate to that, right? If you think of these spaces, they really are the last wild spaces that we have left. If we don't support them with tourism, they will just be encroached by crops, cattle, these animals will be wiped out. And then our greatest sense of joy will really evaporate. And can you imagine the immeasurable loneliness of spirit if we have no wildlife to go and see, no wild spaces to go into? I mean, they're already so limited and so condensed of what's left. I think, one doesn't want to turn anything into mass tourism. We've seen the disasters of Venice, of Capri, of these places that, just get eradicated and the magic gets lost. And I do think that there has to be a very, very sensitive balance in terms of the land management, the government policies, of just how much tourism is possible in an area that allows for the community, allows for the tourism, allows for the animals. How do we get that balance right? And I think that is a very big challenge that I certainly don't have the answers to, but I think, that's our greatest challenge of all.
Yeah, and it's an impossible tightrope between kind of exclusivity and accessibility, between wealth creation and creating, too much of it, like you say, mass industry, which is unattractive. That's tourism everywhere, I suppose.
And that's where I think that the luxury model really counts, Fred. Like if you look at Rwanda, for example, where they are focused on high dollar spend, low traffic, to me, personally, that's the model that we need to be deploying, where we're engaging the community to understand what the tourist means and how that can increase the value of their life, where there's some kind of economics linked to the model of conservation. That's where it really works, right? In Rwanda, 10% of all that tourism goes to the community. And so now they want to be part of it. Now they understand it. You also want local people to have the ability to experience these things, like going to see the gorillas. And so in Rwanda, as a local, you go for free. You don't pay the 1,500. Go have the magic, understand what the tourist is experiencing, be proud of it. And that's the thing that's so special in Africa, is that anyone in tourism, whether you're carrying a bag, pumping the gas, or guiding the guest, is so proud of the land, of the animals, of the experience, of the joy that they're going to be able to give you. And I think that is so essential that is maintained. And that's the sort of top layer. And then, of course, the economics need to be making sense for the community to support the tourism and be part of it, not separate from it, because that's when the disasters, kicks in.
Yeah, and I also think there's a virtuous circle which doesn't often get talked about, but the Americans, for example, are quite a generous philanthropic society, and they've developed this interest in Africa and conservation or whatever it is, And it gets them into that good ecosystem of charitable giving, donations, or a lifelong interest in that, which is another side of what you do, which I think which helps. It's not just while they're on the ground, it's a lifetime interest. Just one point I wanted to bring up. I imagine, just coming back to being a woman in this industry, I imagine when you started out doing this, particularly the safari end of African tourism and the guiding element, very, very male dominated. Did you come up against any challenges being a woman in this industry?
The Wall Street of the bush.
Yeah.
The Wall Street of the bush. I would have made a lot more money in banking, but I probably would have been a lot more unhappy. Yeah, it's challenging. It's challenging, and
Still?
it's still very sexist. And I don't care because I'm from New York. I don't care, you know. But it is. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. It's a boys' club, and a women are not welcome. And it is a constant challenge. I think there are some big visionaries, thank goodness, who've been incredibly supportive and have backed me, and I'm very grateful for that. But there are a lot of little people too that don't want to be demanded of and commanded of. And the problem is I'm servicing the very highest echelon of the market who don't have time to get it wrong. And they have needs that need to be met. And I've promised those. And I have to deliver on them. And one thing I won't do is let anyone down ever. If you've got my word, you've got my word, and I'll move heaven and earth to get there. And a lot of people don't like that.
I can see that. That might be the case. I just wanted to go to some of the things you're doing now and the innovative approaches Raw Africa has to the redefined safari experience or African experience. It's sort of incredible what you're doing. Can you just talk through some of those programs and initiatives you've got going on?
Yeah, with pleasure, Fred. I mean, I think that, one thing that irks me is that people think that coming to Africa is just for safari, right? And I am agree of that with that. You don't want to come all that way and not go on safari. But there's just so much more to the fabric of Africa and the experience. And so I've really wanted to create other angles to highlight artists, artisans, some of the remarkable work that comes out of Africa. The flora, the fauna, Cape Town being one of the smallest floral biome, but with the richest plant content of all five of them. The food, the wine, the golf, even, I find it quite sad how the media has kind of cut up where you go. You want to play golf, you go to Scotland. You want to go fishing, you go here. You want to go to art, you go to Miami for Art Basel, blah, blah, blah. Africa's got so much and it's still so undiscovered, and it's backed by some of the highest levels of hospitality anywhere in the world. So a lot of my sort of job, I think, as a woman lends itself to open these doors to the other pieces of what's possible to experience. And having grown up there and come from a family with a long lineage there's a lot of very unique access that we have that I've been able to build trips around.
I should just quickly interject there that your lineage goes so far back that you're actually related to Daniel Hugo, one of the original Huguenot emigrants from the Netherlands to South Africa, if that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So he left from there, but he was from La Champagne in France. So yeah, that's 1688.
That's another podcast. That one, that's a really interesting story. But sorry, I interrupted. Back to what you're doing with those initiatives.
So I think, you're saying how are we redefining the experience? I think we're really just trying to take people deeper and into much more immersive experiences in all sorts of areas of interest. Whenever I find special access to something, on Saturday I launched a Gardens of Africa trip, which is an extraordinary sort of week-long discovery of the fynbos, which is in South Africa, some of the most extraordinary gardens on earth that nobody's ever seen or heard of because nobody's ever written about them. We had the Garden Club of America some years back, and they just said to me, "This is the most incredible trip we've ever done in our lives," and they had no concept of what was actually there. So I think the goal is to expose more of Africa and its beauty to people because it's so unknown. But then there's also the sort of human discovery and sort of healing element of what Africa provides, and going deeper into finding your true wealth in the wild, of going deeper past that initial big five experience of what's actually happening here. And so I also work with David White, who is a very famous philosopher and poet. I don't know if you know his work, but just extraordinary, extraordinary man. And so we do a retreat every year on, what does it mean to be human? And how does one unpack this life that we get to live? And doing that in the wild is pretty profound. And we focus on, sort of how do tribes and sort of tribal life work with those elements? How do we come in as Westerners and fit into this picture? And what do we take back with us that might alter our lives and make them more full of joy and awe each day? So finding different angles of these very life-changing experiences and putting words to try to understand them has been part of it.
I mean, that's fascinating. And then you also go from that kind of more mindful or cultural stuff to some quite high octane experiences as well with the Emirates partnership. Can you just describe that?
Yeah, with pleasure. So that's our sort of absolute crown jewel product, and probably, I would say, the very best trip in the world today. It was a sort of invention of mine out of COVID, addressing a question that I'd been asked for 15 years. Deborah, I want to go to Africa. I want to go once. Where do I go? And you think of the size of that continent, it fits the United States, China, India, and more into one continent. So where do you go when you've got 12 days of vacation? I have no idea. But I was privileged enough to meet a captain on one of my flights on Emirates. He was Zimbabwean. He told me about the jet. I saw it. I got on it, and I was like, how are we going to use this aircraft to address this question of, Deborah, I only want to go to Africa once. Where do I go? And so we came up with, what are the four most iconic destinations? Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, the Okavango Delta in Botswana, the Great Migration in Kenya, and the gorillas in Rwanda. And could we do that in 12 days on this remarkable magic carpet of a jet, the only one in the world of its kind, 10 passengers, at the very best time of year to have all of these experiences sequenced to the best moments? And we did. And it's called the Greatest Safari on Earth. We run it twice a year. It is incredibly luxurious, but it is also in that silver bullet, right, that answers that question. This is the best of Africa in 12 days.
And does Zuckerberg and Bezos get on well when they're on this together, or do they fall out?
So I have to host it. So I'm very sensitive to who we let on, and we do have a conversation. And the lovely thing is, I've had some extraordinarily special people come on it. They're usually accomplished in a very different phase of life, looking for more, looking for enjoyment, looking to meet like-minded people, perhaps, that they can then travel with on other trips. And the friendships that have formed have been remarkable, and many have come back. I mean, can you imagine doing that trip twice? Well, I've done it 9 times, but I mean, it's several people have done it a few times over. They just love it. And traveling on that plane, it kind of ruins you for life. It's like, okay,
I bet.
know.
And I should say, it's almost too much of an obvious question to ask, but you're obviously you're carbon offsetting that whole trip for obvious reasons.
Yeah, everything is carbon offset, and it does go back into projects on the ground, building trees, fresh water, putting bridges in place. I mean, I think that's the essential point of it. I don't think jet travel is going away. I think as long as these airlines are on a race to the bottom, and that the awful experience of travel that we all have to endure with commercial, until that's elevated and more sane and sanitized, people are going to opt for private jets. But now, how do we do private jet travel in a way that we can make it as least impact, least problematic as possible? And so that's really what we tried to do, because I just don't think people are going to stop. There's no alternative.
And I should say about just going back to the people you have on it is you had Robert Redford about 10 years ago. You took him to Africa. For me, that's a bit personal because I love that film. And at the beginning of the film, it's my cousin on the horse charging across somewhere in Kenya, wherever they filmed it, the Mara probably. That was him doing it.
Wow,
So
that's so
what was it?
cool.
What was it like to have Robert Redford?
Yeah, he's incredible. I mean, what an honor, what an absolute honor. Bob and Billy, just the most gracious, lovely people, so respectful of the environment, so interested in conservation. Obviously, he's a huge, promoter of conservation and has had incredible impact in the United States and at what he had at Sundance and created there. But just really such an honor. I watched that film as an 8-year-old girl in the movies in Zimbabwe, and I
Oh,
was
this beautiful.
blown away.
The
Yeah.
soundtrack, the whole cinematography, it's incredible.
And I think he doesn't realize, I've told him many times actually, that that movie really instrumentally changed tourism in Africa. And he created an absolute dream for so many people that has inspired people to come to Africa. And so grateful for that.
Deborah, I'd love to now ask just some sort of more quick-fire questions. Firstly, I just have to ask, where is home for you in the world? Where do you feel at home? If that might be an obvious one, but it might be a surprising answer. I don't know.
Home for me is Zimbabwe. It always will be. My heart is there. Yeah, the air, the everything. The moment I touch down every year when I go back on the greatest safari on earth, I'm home. Cape Town is probably my second home.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, anywhere in Africa, Kenya, Botswana, when I'm in the wild, I'm home. Those are my people. Those are the people that raised me. That's home.
Yeah, okay. And then I'm going to ask the really annoying question because you shouldn't have favorites. But if you could advise someone to go to one place in Africa, where would it be?
Botswana.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's wild, it's pristine, it's real, it's untouched. It's the last magical landscape that you will see anywhere on that continent, where you fly for hours and you don't see a road and you don't see a power line or a swimming pool or a lodge. And, they have done such a remarkable job of protecting that land and creating just this massive expanse of wilderness that you just won't see flying, unfortunately, over South Africa or Kenya even.
And Deborah, I'd love to just ask as well what, rhyming a bit with what we talked about earlier, that there's more to Africa than just safaris. What's the most unusual thing or counter-conventional thing you could advise someone to do in Africa?
I would say that if you've done the big 5, then you definitely want to do the gorillas, because there's nothing more profound than experiencing 98% of your DNA staring back at you, at those gracious, humble, beautiful, beautiful gorillas. Once is not enough.
Yeah, great answer. So we also ask at the end of every podcast the same 4 questions to everyone, and I'm going to put you in that seat if that's okay. The first question is, what would you most change about your industry? And you don't have to be politically correct. I don't think you're going to be. I don't think you are politically correct.
No, I'm not. I would want to see more women in leadership positions.
Fair enough. What most concerns you about the world we're leaving this next generation?
iPhones and screens,
This is amazing because you work in, essentially, like, a lot of your job is conservation, and yet we asked this question 4 years ago and everyone said the environment, and now everyone says technology and iPhones.
Oh, really? Is that so?
Because everyone's saying it. It's amazing. It's on everyone's mind, clearly.
Yeah, it's devastating to see the lack of communication, the disintegration of writing skills, just the entire human being is disintegrating in my mind.
Yeah, and now we're getting AI. We don't even have to critically think.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, I know. It's going to happen.
Heading to the abyss. Fair enough. So if you had to give up your job tomorrow, Deborah, what would you do? You're not allowed to work in this industry.
Wow.
Would you
Not
go
at
back
all.
Would you go back to tech sales?
Never. No, I'd do something, not in this industry, but I'd do something for women. to help uplift women and help women start businesses and have the confidence and drive and resilience to financially make themselves independent.
Last question. What's the most exciting thing for you in the next 5 years?
Sharing as much of Africa I can with new people, new clients, new friends.
Perfect. Good answer. And Deborah, thank you so much for your time today. It's such a great topic, and what you've created is just so interesting. Thanks for telling us about it.
Thank you, Fred, for having me, and thanks for your interest in all that we've been doing.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been What the Lux. You can find us on socials at Matter of Form, and drop us any questions or comments on Twitter using the hashtag #WhatTheLux. Or if you're a luxury brand looking for strategy and design that goes beyond the banal, get in touch via hello@matterofform.com and chat to one of our consultants.